You'd think a man standing in front of a judge, seconds away from being sentenced to hang, would beg, cry, say anything to save his own neck. That's what almost every one of us would do. But when the judges read out the death sentences for the men and women who ran Hitler's camps, something strange happened again and again in courtroom after courtroom, country after country. They didn't break down, they didn't beg. Most of them said the exact same thing, and by the end of this video you're going to understand why that one phrase terrified the judges more than any confession ever could. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was over. Berlin had fallen, Hitler was dead in a bunker, and across the ruins of the Third Reich, Allied soldiers were walking into places that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Dachau, Mauthausen. Camps filled with the starving, the dying, and the dead, stacked in numbers no one back home could picture. The soldiers who liberated these camps weren't trained for what they found. Some of them vomited, some of them cried, and almost all of them wanted the same thing, for someone to pay. So the trials began. Not years later, not after some slow bureaucratic wind-up, but almost immediately. Within months, courtrooms were being built out of whatever was left standing. Judges from Britain, from the United States, from Poland, from the new International Tribunal at Nuremberg were suddenly faced with a question no legal system had ever really answered before. How do you put an entire system of murder on trial? How do you judge men who say they were just doing their jobs? There was no rule book for this. No precedent sitting on a shelf that any of these judges could pull down and follow. Investigators were still finding mass graves, while lawyers were drafting the charges. Survivors who could barely stand were being asked to walk into a room and identify, by face, the person who had beaten them or sent their families to the gas chambers. Military photographers documented the camps in numbers that would later become courtroom exhibits, stacks of photographs so grim that some jurors reportedly had to leave the room. And standing at the center of almost every one of these proceedings were not the architects of the Holocaust sitting safely in Berlin. Most of those men were already dead, by suicide or by hiding. The people actually available to stand trial were the ones who had been closest to the killing with their own hands. The guards, the commandants, the men who pulled levers, and the officers who gave the day-to-day orders on the ground. The first real test came at a place called Lüneburg in the autumn of 1945. This was the Belsen trial, and sitting in the dock was a man the British press had already nicknamed the Beast of Belsen. His name was Josef Kramer, and he had commanded the camp where thousands died of starvation and disease in the final weeks of the war. Next to him sat a 21-year-old woman named Irma Grese, a guard so notorious among survivors that they gave her a name of her own. Some called her the hyena. She had a reputation for cruelty that unsettled even hardened soldiers. Picture that courtroom. Survivors giving testimony feet away from the people who had tortured them. Photographs of the dead passed from hand to hand among the judges. And through all of it, Grese sat there calm, almost bored. Witnesses and reporters in the gallery kept saying the same thing about her. She smiled. She looked amused. When the verdict came down and the judge told her she would hang, she didn't scream, she didn't collapse, she didn't ask for mercy. She simply sat there like she'd been told she'd lost a card game. You'd expect a 19 or 20-year-old woman facing execution to fall apart in that final month. But that's not what the guards who watched her cell reported. Right up until the morning of December the 13th, 1945, in a prison in Hameln, Britain's chief executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, arrived to carry out 10 hangings in a single day. Grese went first among the women, and according to the accounts of that morning, as she stood on the trap door with the rope already around her neck, her final word to the hangman was just one word: Schnell. Quick, that's it. That's what she chose to say with the very last breath she had control over. Not a denial, not an apology, not a plea to God, just an instruction to hurry up and get it over with. Some records even suggest she had to be walked to the gallows because her legs wouldn't fully cooperate, but her voice never cracked. Kramer went to the gallows that same morning, hanged in a pair alongside another camp official once the women had been processed first. Reporters allowed near the prison that day described the men as subdued, almost mechanically compliant, walking where they were told to walk without a struggle. No last-minute confession, no outburst. Just the same flat, cooperative silence that had marked most of the trial itself. During the proceedings at Lüneburg, Kramer's own defense had leaned on the same idea that would echo through courtroom after courtroom for the next 6 years, that he was a camp administrator carrying out policy set by people above him, that the starving and the dying were the result of the collapsing war, not of decisions he had personally made. The judges didn't buy it. Neither did the historical record. Now, hold on to that detail, because it's going to matter more than you think. Because Grese and Kramer weren't the strange exception in this story. They were the pattern. Fast forward a year and a half to a bright morning inside the very camp she and Kramer had once served, at Auschwitz itself. the man who had commanded that camp for most of its existence, Rudolf Höss, was standing on a gallows the Polish government had built deliberately next to the crematorium where hundreds of thousands of his victims had been burned. Höss had been tried by the Polish Supreme National Tribunal earlier that spring of 1947, and the numbers laid out in that trial are almost impossible for a human mind to hold. Roughly 1 million people killed under the operation of the camp he ran. Witnesses who watched Höss in the final weeks before his execution noticed something almost clinical about him. An American military psychologist who had studied him described him as matter-of-fact, apathetic, someone who seemed to show only a belated interest in the size of his own crimes, as if the scale of it had genuinely never occurred to him until someone else pointed it out. Not haunted, not tortured by guilt in any visible way, almost administrative about the whole thing, the same way he'd once been administrative about railway timetables and gas chamber capacity. The trial itself, held before the Polish Supreme National Tribunal that March, brought forward witnesses who had survived what Höss had built. Testimony about selections on the train platform, about the gas chambers disguised as shower blocks, about children separated from their mothers within minutes of arrival. Prosecutors laid out documents in Höss's own handwriting, records so methodical that they read less like the confessions of a killer and more like the meeting minutes of a factory manager reporting on output. That contrast between the horror of what the documents described and the flat, procedural language used to describe it unsettled the courtroom more than almost anything the survivors themselves testified to. And when it came time to explain himself, to answer for the deaths of roughly 1 million human beings, Höss gave the same answer that was becoming a chorus across every one of these trials. He said he had only followed orders. Now, here's where it gets complicated, because in a private letter to his wife, written just days before he died, Höss wrote something that sounded almost like remorse. He admitted he had inflicted terrible wounds on humanity and asked for forgiveness. So which one is the truth? The apathetic bureaucrat the psychologist described, or the man in that letter asking God to forgive him? Maybe both. Maybe that's the most unsettling possibility of all, that a man can genuinely believe he was just following orders and still, somewhere underneath that belief, know exactly what he did. Because here's the thing you need to understand about that phrase. I was just following orders. It wasn't just Grese's icy calm or Höss's strange detachment. That exact defense, in one form or another, was about to become the single most repeated sentence in the history of war crimes trials. 2 years after Höss walked to that gallows at Auschwitz, in a converted courtroom back at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, a very different kind of defendant took the stand. His name was Otto Ohlendorf, and unlike the camp guards, he hadn't spent years hiding behind fences and watchtowers. He was an intellectual, a trained economist, a father. He had commanded something called Einsatzgruppe D, one of the mobile killing units that followed the German army into the Soviet Union with a single purpose: to murder Jews, Roma, and anyone else the regime considered an enemy, not in camps, but in open fields, forests, and ravines, unit by unit, town by town. Ohlendorf sat calmly in that courtroom and admitted, in plain, unemotional language, that his men were responsible for the deaths of roughly 90,000 people. He confirmed that this included children. He wasn't forced to confess this under torture or trickery. He said it himself, almost his testimony offered freely, like a man reading out a quarterly report. Prosecutors barely had to press him. He described troop movements, kill counts, and logistics with the same tone he might have used to describe a supply chain, and when asked how he could possibly justify it, his defense came down to that same sentence, dressed up in more sophisticated language than Grese or Höss had used, but underneath, identical. He was a soldier. He received an order from a legitimate government. He carried it out. Reporters covering the trial noted how unsettling that composure was to watch. This wasn't a man stammering through excuses. It was a man calmly walking the court through mass murder as if it were a policy he still believed in, and then explaining with the same calm why none of it was his fault. The judges at Nuremberg had to grapple with something genuinely new in legal history. If soldiers can never be blamed for obeying orders, then no one is ever responsible for anything, and the whole idea of a war crime collapses. So the tribunal drew a hard line. They ruled that following an order does not protect you if that order is obviously, unmistakably illegal under basic human morality and international law. They said, in effect, you always had a choice, and choosing to become efficient at murder is still a choice. Ohlendorf was sentenced to death, and he was hanged at Landsberg prison in June of 1951, one of the very last executions to come out of the entire Nuremberg process. Now stop for a second, because if you've been paying attention, you should be noticing something that should genuinely unsettle you. 3 different trials, 3 different countries running them, 3 completely different types of defendants: a female camp guard barely into her 20s, a camp commandant who ran an industrial killing operation, and an educated officer who commanded roving death squads across an entire front line. And every single one of them, when the moment of judgment arrived, reached for some version of the exact same lifeline. That's the part most people never get told about these trials. It wasn't a handful of monsters each inventing their own twisted logic. It was almost a script, as if somewhere along the way, an entire generation of men and women had been handed the same set of words to say when the world finally asked them to account for what they'd done. But before we get to why that phrase became so universal, and trust me, the reason is more disturbing than the phrase itself, you need to hear about the ones who didn't follow the script, because there were a few, and the way they broke from the pattern tells you almost as much as the pattern does. At the Dachau trials, run by American military courts, and later at the Mauthausen proceedings, prosecutors occasionally ran into a defendant who simply collapsed, broke down sobbing in the dock, begged, turned on former comrades to save himself, spilling details about command structures and orders that other defendants had sworn didn't exist. These men were rare enough that legal observers at the time actually remarked on it, because the far more common reaction, sitting there in the defendant's chair with a hangman's noose waiting somewhere down the corridor of the coming weeks, was flat, controlled denial. Not hysteria, not tears. A strange, almost bureaucratic calm, wrapped around the same 4 or 5 words. If you were the judge sitting behind that bench, hearing that same defense over and over from people who had done unspeakably different things, on unspeakably different scales, would you have believed any of them? Or does the fact that literally everyone said it tell you it was never really about individual conscience at all? That it was something closer to a shared reflex? A psychological escape hatch built into the entire system long before any of these people ever stood trial? I'd genuinely like to know what you think, because historians still argue about this, and there isn't a clean answer. If stories like this are the kind of history most people never actually get taught in school, this channel exists for exactly that gap. The parts of the record that get compressed into a single paragraph in a textbook when they deserve an hour of your attention. If that's your kind of thing, subscribing costs nothing and it means you won't miss the next one. So let's actually answer the question the title of this video is asking. What was the one thing they all said? It boiled down to a phrase that, in the language most of them were raised speaking, is chillingly short. Befehl is befehl. An order is an order. In English, it came out however the individual defendant chose to dress it up. I was carrying out my duty. I had no choice. I was a soldier obeying a legitimate command. I would have been shot myself if I'd refused. But strip away the vocabulary and it's the same 4 words every time. I was just following orders. Historians and psychologists have spent decades trying to explain why that particular defense became so universal. And one of the most influential answers came a decade later, from a philosopher named Hannah Arendt, who sat in a Jerusalem courtroom in 1961 watching a former SS officer named Adolf Eichmann give testimony. Eichmann hadn't personally run a camp or pulled a trigger. He had organized train schedules, deportation logistics, paperwork that happened to end with human beings arriving at gas chambers. And watching him, Arendt didn't see a raging monster. She saw a small, fussy bureaucrat obsessed with rules and procedure who seemed almost incapable of grasping what those rules and procedures had actually produced. She coined a phrase for it that's still used today, the banality of evil. The idea that atrocity on an industrial scale doesn't usually require monsters. It requires ordinary people willing to stop asking questions the moment someone above them says the decision has already been made. What struck Arendt most wasn't that Eichmann lied about his role. It was that he genuinely seemed to believe his own defense. He wasn't performing innocence for the judges. He appeared to have spent over a decade convincing himself that moving paperwork couldn't possibly make him a murderer. Even when that paperwork determined which trains left, which stations, carrying which families toward which camps. Court psychiatrists who examined him found no trace of the sadism you might expect from someone connected to that much death. Just a man obsessed with efficiency, promotions, and doing his job well, who had simply never let himself finish the sentence describing what his job actually was. That's the real answer to why they all said the same thing. It wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't coordinated. It was because an entire system had spent over a decade training people to believe that responsibility always belonged to somebody else, somebody further up the chain, until eventually there was no one left at the top of that chain except a dead man in a bunker who couldn't be tried at all. Every single defendant who said, "I was just following orders," was, whether they realized it or not, pointing at a ladder that conveniently had no top rung left standing. Even the men who ministered to these prisoners in their final days noticed it. An American Army chaplain assigned to sit with condemned Nazi officials in their last weeks wrote afterward about how unnervingly ordinary many of them seemed up close. Men who worried about their families, complained about prison food, asked for cigarettes, the same small human concerns as anyone else sitting only days away from a gallows built for crimes almost too large to comprehend. That contrast between the smallness of the man and the size of what he'd done is exactly what made the just following orders defense so seductive to the people saying it. It let them stay small. It let them believe, right up until the trap door opened, that they had simply been a cog, and cogs don't get to choose. The judges, to their enormous credit, refused to accept that logic. Whether it was the tribunal at Nuremberg, the British military court at Lüneburg, or the Polish tribunal at Auschwitz, the ruling kept coming back the same way. Being told to do something evil does not make you innocent for doing it. You still had a mind. You still had legs that could have walked away, even if walking away meant risking your own life. That principle, that following an unlawful order is not a legal shield, became one of the most important legacies of these trials. It's written into international law to this day, and it's the same principle that still gets invoked whenever a soldier, a police officer, or a government official tries to excuse an atrocity by pointing up the chain of command. Which brings us back to the executions themselves, because the sentences didn't stay theoretical for long. Kramer, Grese, and 8 others were hanged in a single day at Hameln in December 1945. Höss was hanged at the site of his own crimes in April 1947, in front of witnesses who had once been his prisoners. Ohlendorf and 3 of his fellow Einsatzgruppen commanders went to the gallows at Landsberg in June 1951, among the very last executions carried out under the Nuremberg process before the Allied powers effectively closed the book on it. Dozens of other guards, commandants, and officers from the Dachau trials, the Mauthausen proceedings, and the Auschwitz garrison trials in Krakow met the same end in the years between, one courtroom and one gallows at a time, until the machinery of these tribunals had processed a war that had claimed millions of civilian lives. American military courts alone tried well over 1,000 defendants connected to Dachau and its satellite camps, and while not every one of them was sentenced to death, the ones who were tended to give the same testimony you've already heard 3 times in this video, just with different names attached to it, different uniforms, different camps, the same 4 words underneath. And in nearly every case, the record shows the same eerie composure walking up those wooden steps that had shown up in the courtroom months before. Not always. There were men who wept, who prayed loudly, who cursed the judges on their way out. But the dominant note, again and again, was control, silence. That same phrase, or its ghost, hanging somewhere behind their eyes even when they didn't say it out loud one last time. What these trials ultimately proved wasn't really about a handful of especially evil individuals. It was about how ordinary the machinery of atrocity can look from the inside, and how easily I was just following orders can feel true to the person saying it, even while it convinces absolutely no one else on earth. That's the part of this story that should sit with you longer than any single execution date or courtroom detail. The idea that the scariest men and women in this story didn't think of themselves as monsters at all. They thought of themselves as employees. If this kind of history is something you want more of, the trials, the testimonies, the moments buried in transcripts that never make it into the documentaries everyone's already seen, do 3 things before you go. Hit like, because it's the fastest way to tell this channel to keep digging into stories like this one. Subscribe, so the next one lands in front of you the moment it's out. And drop your answer to that question from earlier down in the comments. Would you have believed them, or is I was just following orders simply what every guilty person says when the only alternative is admitting the truth? I read those comments, and on a story like this one, I genuinely want to know where you land. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.